3 days. That was all it took. In the space of 72 hours in November of 2022, the 15 largest cryptocurrencies on Earth shed more than $150 billion in value. At the center of that wreckage sat a single company and a single token. FTX's native coin, FTT, plunged more than 80% in value beginning on the 6th of November. By the time the dust settled, one of the most celebrated companies in the entire industry had ceased to exist. But the number that matters most in this story is smaller and far more disturbing. Somewhere in the machinery of this collapse, roughly $8 billion of ordinary customers' money simply vanished. Not lost in a market downturn that everyone could see coming. Not wiped out by a single catastrophic bet. It disappeared quietly, over months, moving between two companies through spreadsheets and lines of computer code that almost no one outside the inner circle ever saw. Money that belonged to teachers, to retirees, to first-time investors, to people who had done nothing more than deposit their savings on an exchange they were told was safe. The question that hangs over everything is deceptively simple. How does $8 billion in customer funds go missing from an exchange that publicly insisted it never touched a cent of client money? That is what this documentary sets out to answer. Not through rumor, not through speculation dressed up as insight, but through the paper trail itself. The bankruptcy filings submitted under oath, and the sworn testimony of the very people who built the system, watched it work, and eventually testified against the man at the top. That man was Sam Bankman-Fried. To the world, he was known simply as SBF, and for a brief, dazzling stretch of time, he was treated as something close to a genius. Rumpled, unshaven, playing video games during investor calls, he cultivated the image of a young idealist who happened to be sitting on one of the great fortunes of his generation. He talked about giving nearly all of it away. Politicians took his money. Celebrities took his endorsements. Major venture firms handed him hundreds of millions of dollars, convinced they were backing the future of finance. At his peak, he was worth billions, and his name was practically synonymous with the promise of crypto going mainstream. His empire rested on two pillars. The first was Alameda Research, a quantitative trading firm he founded in 2017 to profit from opportunities in the crypto markets. The second was FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange he launched 2 years later, in 2019, which grew with staggering speed into the fourth largest derivatives exchange in the world. Bankman-Fried was the majority owner of both. And that is precisely where the trouble begins. Because here is what customers were told, again and again. FTX and Alameda were separate, distinct, independent operations that just happened to share a founder. When you deposited your money on FTX, that money was yours. It sat there. It was safe. It was not being gambled with, not being loaned out, not being funneled into risky trades. In 2019, Bankman-Fried himself tweeted that Alameda's account on the exchange was, in his words, just like everyone else's. No special treatment. No backdoor. That separation was not a technical detail. It was the entire foundation of trust. An exchange is supposed to be a custodian, a vault, a neutral place that holds your assets and does nothing else with them. A trading firm is the opposite. It takes risks, it makes bets, it wins and loses. Keeping the two apart is the difference between a bank and a casino. And when investors like Paradigm handed FTX nearly $300 million, they did so only after being assured, explicitly, that Alameda received no preferential treatment whatsoever. But the wall between these two companies was not what the public believed. In the code that ran the exchange, in a bank account with an unfamiliar name, and in a private internal ledger, that separation had already quietly collapsed long before the world found out. To understand how the money moved, we have to go back to the beginning and follow it, step by step, exactly as the witnesses described it under oath. The story starts in 2017 with a company called Alameda Research. This was Sam Bankman-Fried's first major venture, a quantitative trading firm built to profit from the wild inefficiencies of the young cryptocurrency market. Alameda made bets. It borrowed money. It took positions. It chased returns wherever it could find them. That was its entire purpose. It was a hedge fund in everything but name, and like any trading operation, it lived and died by the risks it chose to take. 2 years later, in 2019, Bankman-Fried launched something very different. FTX was a cryptocurrency exchange, a marketplace where ordinary people and professional traders alike could buy, sell, and store digital assets. The distinction between these two businesses matters more than almost anything else in this story, so it's worth being precise about it. A trading firm gambles with its own money. An exchange holds other people's money. One takes risks. The other is supposed to safeguard. And Bankman-Fried owned the majority of both. That fact alone was not a crime. Plenty of people run multiple companies. What made it dangerous was the specific combination. One company designed to make aggressive bets, and another company sitting on a mountain of customer deposits, both controlled by the same man. If any barrier between them failed, the temptation and the opportunity would be enormous. The risky bets of the trading firm could quietly be funded by the savings of the exchange's customers, and those customers would never know. FTX understood this perfectly well. That's exactly why the company insisted over and over in public statements and private meetings that FTX and Alameda were separate entities operating at arm's length. The message to the world was simple and reassuring. There were firewalls in place. Customer funds stayed with FTX. Alameda's trading happened somewhere else, walled off, with no special access. Your money was your money, and no one, not even the founder, could touch it to cover a losing bet. This promise was not incidental. It was the foundation the entire enterprise stood on. An exchange is, at its core, a trust machine. People deposit their assets because they believe those assets will be there when they come back for them. Strip away that belief, and there is no exchange. There is only a pile of other people's money and a group of people deciding what to do with it. FTX grew into the fourth largest derivatives exchange in the world precisely because millions of people, and some of the most sophisticated investors on the planet, believed the promise. To keep that promise, or at least to appear to keep it, Bankman-Fried surrounded himself with a small circle of people who would later become central to everything that unraveled. There was Caroline Ellison, who became the chief executive of Alameda Research. On paper, she ran the trading firm. Her name at the top of Alameda gave the appearance of independence, the sense that Alameda was its own operation with its own leadership, distinct from FTX and from Bankman-Fried himself. That appearance would later become a point of fierce dispute. There was Gary Wang, the co-founder. Wang was the technical mind, the engineer who built and controlled the actual code that made FTX run. If the firewalls between FTX and Alameda existed anywhere, they existed in that code. And that meant that if someone wanted to quietly remove those firewalls, the code was exactly where it would happen. And there was Nishad Singh, another member of the inner circle, deeply involved in the software and the operations that kept the exchange functioning. For people, a tight, insular group who had known each other, in some cases, for years. They lived together, worked together, and made decisions together in a way that blurred the very lines their public statements claimed were sharp and unbreakable. So here is the picture as the outside world saw it. Two companies, a clear wall between them, customer money protected, a promise, repeated endlessly, that the exchange was safe. Now let's follow the money and see what was actually happening on the other side of that wall. To understand what went wrong at FTX, you have to understand how a crypto exchange is supposed to work. When you deposit money onto a platform like this, that money is yours. The exchange holds it for you, the way a bank holds your savings. If you want to trade with borrowed funds, you can, but only up to a limit set against the collateral you've put up. And crucially, if your bets go bad and your losses eat through that collateral, the system steps in. Automatically, it liquidates your position, sells off your holdings to cover the debt, and protects the exchange and everyone else on it from being dragged down with you. This is not optional. It is not something a human decides in the moment. It is written into the software itself, an unforgiving rule enforced in milliseconds. Every ordinary customer on FTX was subject to it. Fall below the threshold, and you were gone. No warning, no mercy, no negotiation. Every ordinary customer, but not all of them. Gary Wang was the co-founder of both FTX and Alameda. He was the one who built much of the platform's underlying code, the engineer who translated Sam Bankman-Fried's vision into working software. And when Wang took the stand, he described something buried deep inside that code, a modification he wrote himself, that changed everything. It was a flag, a single setting attached to one specific account, and the account it was attached to belonged to Alameda Research. In the codebase, It was labeled with a phrase that would come to define the entire trial. Allow negative. Think about what those two words actually mean in this context. Every other account on the exchange had a hard floor. Your balance could not go below zero because the liquidation engine would never let it. But Alameda's account had that floor removed. It could carry a negative balance. It could go into the red, deeply into the red, and the system would simply permit it. No liquidation would trigger. No alarm would sound. The automatic protections that governed everyone else were switched off for this one privileged account. Wang was direct about what this meant in practice. Alameda could withdraw funds from FTX even when it didn't have the money to cover those withdrawals. And the money it was withdrawing wasn't sitting in some separate corporate treasury. It was customer money. The deposits that thousands of ordinary users believed were safely held for them could be pulled out by Alameda, drawn down through that negative balance, and used however Alameda saw fit. The scale of the privilege is hard to overstate. This wasn't a generous credit limit. It wasn't a large but bounded line of borrowing. Wang testified that the arrangement gave Alameda what amounted to an effectively unlimited line of credit, backed by the pooled funds of FTX's customers. There was no ceiling that the system would enforce. Alameda could keep drawing, and the code would keep saying yes. Now hold this next to what Bankman-Fried had told the public. Back in 2019, he had tweeted that Alameda's account on the exchange was, in his words, just like everyone else's. Just like everyone else's. Except it had a special flag written into the software that exempted it from the single, most important rule on the platform. Except it could go negative when no one else could. Except it could withdraw customer money without limit while every other account was liquidated the instant it stepped out of line. This is the part that strips away any comfortable explanation about accidents or oversight. A liquidation engine that fails is a bug. A flag deliberately written into the code, attached to one specific account, that switches off the protections for that account alone, is a decision. Someone had to conceive of it. Someone had to write it. Someone had to choose which account it applied to. Wang wrote it, and he testified that he did so at Bankman-Fried's direction, alongside the others in that small, insular group. The wall between the two companies, the one described so confidently to the public, had a door built into it from the very beginning. And through that door flowed the money of people who never knew it existed. To understand where that money went, you first have to understand how it arrived. In the early days, FTX couldn't open a bank account of its own. So when customers wired money in, that money didn't land in an account bearing the exchange's name. It landed in an account belonging to a company called North Dimension. On paper, North Dimension looked like an unrelated business. In reality, it was controlled by Alameda Research. Think about what that means. A customer in another country decides to deposit $50,000 to trade crypto. They send a wire transfer. That transfer travels not to FTX, but to a shell company sitting inside the trading firm that already had a secret door into customer funds. From the very first dollar, the trail was blurred. Inside FTX's systems, there was a way to keep score. An internal account, plainly named fiat at ftx.com. Its purpose was to track how much Alameda owed FTX for all those customer deposits that had been funneled its way. It was, in effect, a running tab. A number that grew as Alameda kept drawing on money that was never its own. By 2022, that number had reached $8 billion. That figure comes from Adam Yedidia, an FTX engineer and one of Bankman-Fried's old friends. He testified that when he discovered Alameda owed FTX $8 billion, drawn from customer deposits, it was the reason he walked away. He learned that the deposits people believed were sitting safely on the exchange had instead been used to repay Alameda's own loans. He quit. So where did $8 billion go? Some of it vanished into the thing Bankman-Fried claimed never happened: risky trading bets. Alameda was a hedge fund at its core, and when the crypto market crashed in May of 2022, tied to the collapse of Terra Luna, lenders like Genesis came calling. They wanted their money back. Alameda didn't have it. So it reached through that door and pulled customer funds to cover the gap. But trading losses were only part of the story. Caroline Ellison testified that roughly $5 billion had been loaned out, tracked through internal spreadsheets rather than any formal ledger. The recipients were startups, various ventures, and political causes. Bankman-Fried announced a $2 billion venture fund on Twitter, and he did it shortly after Ellison had warned him that such a fund would make Alameda dramatically riskier. He launched it anyway. There were investments in outside companies. There was luxury real estate in the Bahamas, where the company was headquartered, property portfolios worth hundreds of millions. There were celebrity endorsements and marketing deals that put FTX's name on stadiums and in Super Bowl commercials, wrapping the operation in a glossy layer of legitimacy. And there were loans to executives themselves, money moving inside the circle. Then there was the political spending. Millions flowed into donations, positioning Bankman-Fried as a major player in Washington, a young billionaire eager to shape the rules of the industry he was quietly hollowing out. Every one of these expenditures needs to be measured against a single, uncomfortable fact. There was no separate pool of money for this. The billions being spent on venture bets, on mansions, on political influence, on loans to friends, were entangled with the deposits of ordinary customers. When Alameda spent, it was often spending money it had drawn through the fiat account, money that belonged to people who thought it was untouchable. And here is where the accounting becomes almost surreal. Ellison testified that Alameda's balance sheet was deliberately dressed up. Illiquid tokens, the so-called Sam coins, were placed on the books at inflated paper values. Meanwhile, the debts were liquid, real, and due. So you had a firm that could show a positive net asset value on paper and still be completely unable to pay what it owed, because its assets couldn't be sold and its liabilities could not wait. The money didn't disappear all at once. It leaked out steadily, through a door most customers never knew existed, into places most of them would never see. For a while, the illusion held. Markets were rising, deposits were flowing in, and nobody was asking hard questions. As long as new money kept arriving, the missing money could stay hidden. But every scheme built on borrowed time eventually meets a moment it can't survive. For FTX and Alameda, that moment arrived in the spring of 2022. In May, a stablecoin called TerraUSD and its sister token Luna imploded. What was supposed to hold a steady $1 value collapsed toward zero, wiping out tens of billions in a matter of days. The shockwave rolled across the entire crypto market. Prices cratered, confidence evaporated, and the lenders who had spent the boom years handing out easy credit suddenly wanted their money back. That was the crack that began to spread. Firms like Genesis, which had loaned billions to Alameda, started calling in their loans. And this is where the hidden fragility became fatal. Alameda's balance sheet was stuffed with illiquid tokens it couldn't sell quickly, while its debts were the kind that came due immediately, in cash. When the lenders knocked, Alameda didn't have what it needed to answer. So it reached for the one source of liquidity that never asked questions. FTX customer funds. Caroline Ellison, testifying later, described the atmosphere inside the company in almost clinical terms. As the loans were recalled, Alameda pulled on billions of dollars that belonged to FTX's users, money those users believed was sitting safely in their accounts. The internal ledger that tracked what Alameda owed FTX kept climbing. By 2022, that figure had swelled to around $8 billion. Ellison testified that she was directed to hide the true financial position. When lenders asked to see Alameda's books, she didn't send them the real picture. She sent versions that were carefully sanitized, doctored to look far less risky than they actually were. Assets were overstated. Liabilities were understated or left off entirely. The goal was simple: keep the lenders calm, keep the loans from being called all at once, and keep the whole structure from tipping over. According to her testimony, it was Bankman-Fried who asked her to put those inflated Sam coins on the balance sheet, tokens like Serum, MAPS, Oxy, and holdings tied to Solana, valued on paper at roughly $1 billion. On the ledger, these looked like assets that could cover the debts. In reality, if Alameda had ever tried to sell them at scale, the prices would have collapsed under the weight of its own selling. They were numbers that existed to reassure, not to repay. And so the panic inside the firm stayed private. To the outside world, FTX and Alameda still looked like winners, still bailing out struggling competitors, still expanding, still radiating confidence. Bankman-Fried even announced the launch of a $2 billion venture fund. This despite Ellison having warned him that pushing more capital out the door would make Alameda far riskier than it already was. He described himself as risk-neutral, comfortable taking any bet with a positive expected value. But the bets weren't being made with his money. They were being made with everyone's. The house of cards was holding, barely. It just needed no one to look too closely. Then someone did. On November 2nd, the news outlet CoinDesk published a report that would set everything in motion. A private document had leaked, an internal balance sheet belonging to Alameda Research. And what it revealed cut straight to the heart of the deception. Alameda claimed to hold more than $14 billion in assets as of the end of June. But a huge portion of that wealth wasn't cash, or blue-chip crypto, or anything independent at all. It was FTT, the token created and controlled by FTX itself. Think about what that actually meant. Alameda's financial health was propped up by a coin printed by its own sister company. The two entities that had always been described publicly as separate, independent, at arm's length, were revealed to be tangled together by a token that FTX itself could inflate and Alameda counted as real money. Caroline Ellison responded on Twitter, insisting the balance sheet was incomplete and that everything was under control. It was not under control, and the world was about to find out just how far from control it truly was. On November 6th, one man decided he had seen enough. Changpeng Zhao, the head of Binance, the largest crypto exchange on the planet, made a public announcement. Binance held a substantial stack of FTT tokens, and it intended to sell them. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth, offloaded onto the open market. For anyone paying attention, the message was unmistakable. Binance had once been among FTX's earliest backers. Now it was walking away, and doing so loudly. The subtext was brutal in its simplicity. If the smartest, best-connected player in the room was rushing for the exit, why would anyone else stay? The panic was instant. FTT began to bleed value. Customers who had parked their savings on FTX started pulling their money out, and once the first wave moved, everyone moved. A single day of trading told the story. FTX processed roughly $4 billion in transactions that November 6th, a figure wildly above anything close to a normal day. By the following day, November 7th, the withdrawal requests had swollen to around $6 billion. This is what a bank run looks like in the digital age. No lines outside a building, no crowds banging on locked doors. Just a silent tidal wave of people all hitting the same button at the same time. Each one trying to be faster than the person next to them. All of them asking for money that, it turned out, was no longer there to give. Because here was the fatal truth. Customer deposits had been funneled into Alameda's reckless bets. The money people believed was sitting safely in their accounts had been spent. When too many of them demanded it back at once, the illusion collapsed. FTX simply could not honor the requests. Withdrawals froze. For a brief, strange moment, it looked like there might be a lifeline. On November 8th, Binance, the very company that had lit the fuse, announced it had agreed to buy FTX outright. A rescue. A rival stepping in to absorb the wreckage. It lasted barely a day. On November 9th, Binance backed out. The deal had never been binding, and once Binance people got a look at the state of FTX's books, they wanted nothing to do with it. Whatever they saw inside was enough to make the world's biggest exchange turn and run. Now there was no buyer, no bailout, no way forward. On November 11th, Sam Bankman-Fried resigned as chief executive. That same day, FTX and Alameda filed for bankruptcy. Given the scale of the liabilities involved, it would stand as the largest crypto-related bankruptcy ever recorded. Into this chaos stepped John Ray III. Ray was not a crypto enthusiast. He was a restructuring specialist, a man who had overseen the unwinding of Enron, one of the most notorious corporate collapses in American history. He had spent his career walking into disasters and sorting through the rubble, and what he found at FTX stunned even him. Ray stated plainly that in all his years, across all the failures he had managed, he had never seen such a complete failure of corporate controls. There were no reliable financial records, no proper oversight. Corporate funds were used to buy homes and personal items. Company decisions rested in the hands of a tiny group of inexperienced individuals. This was not a company that had made a few bad calls. It was a company that had never, in any meaningful sense, been run at all. While lawyers and accountants dug through the wreckage, the human cost came into focus. Consider Mark Anthony Juliet. He had $100,000 sitting on FTX. Real money. His money. And when the platform froze, he could not touch a single cent of it. He was one of millions of ordinary people who had trusted a smiling young billionaire and his promises, only to log in one morning and discover that the account balance meant nothing. To make it worse, in the days after the bankruptcy filing, FTX began investigating a suspected hack. Analytics firm Elliptic reported that more than $370 million in crypto had gone missing. The vault had not just failed. It had been emptied. The reckoning came quietly at first, then all at once. Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas, extradited to the United States, and marched into a Manhattan courtroom to answer for what prosecutors described as one of the largest financial frauds in American history. The charges were staggering. If convicted on every count, he faced a sentence that could stretch beyond 100 years, the rest of his life, and then some. But the most devastating part of the trial was not the paperwork or the numbers. It was the people. The very same inner circle that had built FTX and Alameda alongside him now sat on the witness stand, one by one, and turned to face the man they had once called a friend. Gary Wang went first among the co-founders. He had written the code that made FTX run, and he had written the code that quietly broke it. He admitted to committing financial crimes with Bankman-Fried, with Nishad Singh, with Caroline Ellison. And then he explained, in plain technical language, exactly how the fraud was engineered. There was a flag buried in the system, he testified, a special permission attached to Alameda's account called Allow Negative. It let Alameda run a negative balance. It let Alameda withdraw without limit. And when Alameda withdrew, Wang confirmed, the money it pulled came straight from the pockets of FTX's customers. Years earlier, Bankman-Fried had tweeted that Alameda's account was just like everyone else's. The code told a different story. Wang also dismantled another of FTX's proud claims. The insurance fund, publicly advertised as being worth more than $100 million, a cushion to protect traders in a crisis. It was fiction. The number displayed to the world, Wang testified, was generated by taking the day's trading volume, multiplying it by a random figure, and dividing by 1 billion. A comforting statistic, conjured out of nothing. Then came Caroline Ellison. She had run Alameda as its CEO, and she had pleaded guilty to fraud and money laundering. On the stand, she described how she had made Alameda's balance sheet look far safer than it truly was, quietly misstating assets and liabilities to hide the danger. She spoke of the Sam coins, illiquid tokens like Serum, MAPS, Oxy, and Solana, valued on paper at around $1 billion, that Bankman-Fried had asked her to include to prop up the numbers. She recalled warning him that a new $2 billion venture fund would make Alameda far riskier. He announced it anyway. Piece by piece, the prosecution built its argument. This was not carelessness. It was not a founder overwhelmed by growth. It was deliberate. The special code, the secret spreadsheets, the missing $8 billion owed to FTX, the investors like Paradigm who handed over nearly $300 million after being promised there was no favoritism for Alameda. All of it pointed one direction. When Bankman-Fried finally testified in his own defense, he clung to a simpler story. He hadn't meant to defraud anyone. FTX had failed because of oversight, poor risk management, a company that grew too big too fast. Ellison, not him, had been running Alameda. But on cross-examination, that story frayed. Again and again, prosecutors held up his own words, his tweets insisting FTX was fine, that customer funds were untouched, that everything was covered, against the evidence stacked behind them. The confident answers gave way to vagueness. The genius founder who once seemed to have an explanation for everything suddenly couldn't quite remember. The jury deliberated for only a matter of hours. The verdict was guilty on every single count. Bankman-Fried was later sentenced to 25 years in prison. And so the empire that had promised to reinvent money ended the way so many empires do. Not with a revolution, but with a courtroom, a confession, and a cell. What FTX revealed went far beyond one man. It exposed an era intoxicated by the myth of the brilliant founder, the wunderkind who could do no wrong, whose confidence we mistook for competence. It showed how easily belief can be manufactured and how quickly it can vanish. And somewhere out there, Mark Anthony Juliet and millions like him are still waiting, still hoping, still owed money that may never fully come home.